back to Historical Context. Today we continue our series on the colonies during the Commonwealth of England. Today we go to Massachusetts Bay, where we last left off in 1652, when the colony was feeling rather comfortable about its relationship with England, going so far as to minting its own currency, the pine tree shilling, and doing so, might I add, with the metal from English shillings. In October, the General Court in Massachusetts met and passed a rather progressive law when it came to the area of education. Let's have a look at the reading. If it should be granted that learning, namely skill in the tongues and liberal arts, is not absolutely necessary for the being of a commonwealth of churches, yet we conceive that, in the judgment of the godly wise, it is beyond all question not only laudable, but necessary for the well-being of the same. And although New England is completely furnished with men in place, and upon occasion of death or otherwise to make officers in the commonwealth, and of teaching elders in the churches, yet for the better discharge of our trust for the next generation, and so to posterity, being the first founders do wear away space, and that it grows more and more difficult to fill places of most in this court, finding by manifest experience that though the number of scholars at our college do increase, yet as soon as they grow up, ready for public use, they leave the country. It is therefore ordered, and hereby enacted by this court, that a voluntary collection be commenced to the inhabitants of this jurisdiction for the raising of such a sum as may be employed for the maintenance of the president, certain fellows and poor scholars in Harvard College, and for that purpose do further order that every town of this jurisdiction do choose one meet person to take the voluntary subscriptions of such as shall underwrite any sum or sums of money for that purpose. So I want to talk about the problem first here. The problem is that people are growing up and they're moving away. And why would that be happening? You got to think about Massachusetts Bay in the 1650s. The colony itself is growing, but it's America at that time is growing outside of certain areas. And so people likely are leaving Massachusetts Bay for places like Maine, possibly Connecticut, possibly even Rhode Island, depending on the situation. They could be going to Virginia now that Virginia is under parliamentary control. They could be going to England too. People in the writings go back to England even after living in the colonies for 30 years. But whatever the cause, the Massachusetts Bay Colony wants to create incentives for people to stay. And this is an issue facing many communities in America today. So we should take some solace in the fact that it's been a problem for 370 years, but the solution may be a little more complicated. Now, Massachusetts Bay is going to try to prevent this with basically an early form of scholarship funding. So we'll see how that goes. The General Court also banned land and asset sales without the presence of a deed. So today, if you see that deed when you do a transfer, the law surrounding that, especially if you live in the state of Massachusetts, the law surrounding that dates all the way back to 1652. The court also recognized John Clark's invention, which saved firewood and warmed rooms with little cost or charges. And I think they're referring to a wood-burning stove here or something similar. The court granted Clark an exclusive 3-year license. And this does not appear to be the same John Clark that is the Baptist out of Rhode Island. I don't think that's the case here. But this gentleman invented a product that saved firewood and warmed rooms much more efficiently. It's a pretty cool thing. I think it's a wood-burning stove, but I don't know for sure. The court was also dealing with forgery in regards to the pine tree shilling. It's only been months. So they enhanced the print by requiring a double ring around the pine tree, the inscription Massachusetts, and the year the coin was produced to be stamped on it. So already forgery is a problem, and they're trying to counter that with new techniques. Packers of beef and pork were also now required to take an oath. So an interesting time in 1652. Now, in May of 1653, John Endicott is elected to his third consecutive term as governor. The colony decides to prohibit trade with the French and the Dutch, and if you'll recall, England had declared war on the Netherlands the year before, so that shouldn't be a surprise. The colony also sets the first rates for horses. Horses were valued based on their age, with 4 years and older harboring the greatest value of 16 pounds each. The court also ordered the increase in taxes to each town. They called them levies back then. The footnotes say that the levies were doubled, but the language in the actual legislation is vague. It just mentions that it went up, so it's hard to tell what the actual increase was. The court also reported that the town of Kittery had been successfully annexed with a general court held in the town, but it didn't go over quite that easily. Let's have a look at the writing. The inhabitants offered to come under the government of the Massachusetts, provided that the articles and conditions tendered by themselves might be received as the ground thereof, which being wholly denied by the commissioners, who told them they must first submit to the government. Then they should be ready to afford such liberties and immunities as they should think meet to grant, whereupon at length they did submit. So Massachusetts Bay was basically saying that, no, we're not going to give you any promises until you submit yourself. A grant was issued to Kittery with several conditions of the town subjecting itself to the rule of Massachusetts Bay. Let's have a look. That the people inhabiting there shall enjoy protection, equal acts of favor and justice with the rest of the people inhabiting on the south side of the river Piscatty within the limits of our whole jurisdiction. Kittery is on the extreme south of modern-day Maine. There's actually a river that runs just south of it, where New Hampshire is on the other side of that river. So they come to an agreement. Kittery comes under the realm of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The grant went on to respect the property boundaries and private ownership that's already been established within the town, and allowed the town one deputy to serve in the Court of Elections for Massachusetts Bay and 2 deputies to serve in the General Court. So they got 1 representative to choose the governor, 2 representatives to help legislate. The grant essentially provides the citizens of Kittery with the same rights and protections as the citizens of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The court later ruled that each of the towns annexed in Maine would establish their own boundaries. So you're on your own to decide what your boundaries are. I hope there aren't 2 towns that are close together. They're going to have to settle that on their own. This court also took up other business, including the granting of 2,000 acres to Harvard College. I wonder what the size of the campus is today compared to that. The commissioners of the United Colonies, which is still continuing, that Confederation of New England Colonies, are also asked to stay in the colony. So the commissioners of the Massachusetts Bay Colony are asked to stay, not to go to their next meeting, due to a risk of conflict with New Netherland. And regarding that war with the Dutch, the commissioners joined the general court to consult on the matter and determine a course of action for the colony. The court reviewed the articles related to the establishment of the original United Colonies and asked whether they justified, those articles, whether they justified engaging in, quote, an offensive or vindictive war. In a lengthy dissertation, the court determined that it is up to the individual jurisdictions and their respective legislatures to determine whether or not to join this war. So it's not a group thing. You decide locally. I want to read a portion of that statement. Let's have a look. A fundamental law of a people or commonwealth is to have liberty and to exercise immediate choice of their own governors, because the supreme governors are betrusted with their lives and estates, in whom under God they do acquiesce. The Massachusetts Bay Colony is deciding to act independently of the group as it pertains to the war with the Dutch. But remember the Pequot War 2 decades earlier, when the same colony, under different leadership, lectured Plymouth about what their perception might be if they did not join the Pequot War. So we see a shift in the colony to one that has less toleration for entering a preemptive war. There is no mention in the writings about addressing what to do if the Commonwealth of England orders the colony in, and that's a real possibility. It's England that has declared war on the Dutch. They could order them in and not care what they have to say, but there's no mention of it. The court met again in August. This time they dealt with the problem of children violating the Lord's Day by toiling, and apparently some adolescents were drinking. Children over the age of 14 were fined, and children between the ages of 7 and 13, their parents were fined. The court also received complaints about the rise in taxes. So they requested an auditor review the finances in general, an auditor general, and that a treasurer report the financial status of the colony to the court on an annual basis. So an auditor is brought in and a treasurer. The son of Captain John Mason, this is a long time ago we talked about this, maybe over a year ago. He is the man responsible for the founding of New Hampshire, and he disappeared nearly 30 years ago. So his son shows up, and he sues Richard Leader for the wrongful sale of lands that he claims belongs to his mother and his father's heirs. Joseph Mason, that's the name of the son, wins the case, and the court is going to lay out the land to be returned to the family. We don't know if this is up in New Hampshire or if it's that island in Massachusetts Bay. John Mason had title to both. In September, the grant of Wells, another town in Maine, was also drawn up, and it was similar to that of Kittery. Wells got 3 representatives to the court, though. They also added the towns of Saco and Cape Porpoise. The General Court also reversed its decision on the conduct of wars. So now all of a sudden they're a team player, after they received letters from Connecticut and the colony of New Haven. The court did not commit to the present conflict. They didn't say we're joining in. That's still undecided. They simply reversed course about what their actual authority is and who they would follow. So now they're a team player. And I'm assuming, if you think about it, Connecticut is but right up against New Netherland. And if New Netherland invades Connecticut, Connecticut wants to know that the other colonies are going to have their back. They don't want this rule floating around out there that you can decide on your own whether or not to join. Connecticut needs more security. In the correspondence, it is specifically mentioned that this decision is being made. Massachusetts Bay is deciding to change course to avoid conflicts with other colonies' commissioners in the Confederation. It's not that they have changed their mind or they theoretically think differently. They just don't want conflict with their own people. It's also mentioned in the September notes that Thomas Dudley, the former co-patriot, if you will, of John Winthrop, but also a rival, has died, and that his estate was being processed through the courts. We're getting to a point where many of the founding colonists of these colonies are dying off, and a new generation is being made responsible for the affairs there. Some of these people in this new generation still born in England, but we're getting to a point soon where many of the people we deal with are going to actually be born in the colonies themselves. A committee was put together to examine the finances of Harvard College, much like the treasurer and auditor that we saw assigned before. They do the same here with Harvard. Taxation and the increase in taxes is causing reforms in Massachusetts Bay government. In 1654, Richard Bellingham is elected the colony's 16th governor. It's his second stint in office. The court this year ordered that each of the laws shall now be printed and distributed after each session to the various towns. And they estimate that the number of copies needed to do this would be around 700. Now, I want people to realize something here. There are printing presses starting up in the New World, but there are no newspapers yet. There are no newspapers. And this is probably one of the earliest forms of that type of distribution. I wouldn't call a printing of the laws necessarily a newspaper, but they're printing and distributing information in mass. It seems like the 1654 court was really trying to adjust to the growth of the colony by passing rules regarding the collection of levies and fines, deadlines for petitions to court. There's a lot of petitions when you read through that writing, pages and pages of them. Well, now they're setting deadlines, and that's probably a good idea. And the establishment of treasurers at the local level. So people are wanting that money kept an eye of because they're paying more and more to the government. The court would be called into session a month later in June after receiving a letter from England. The letter isn't in the writings, but it likely has to do with Oliver Cromwell being named Lord Protector because that happens at about the same time. The court also decides when it comes to publishing laws, as we just talked about, not to publish the law that requires laws to be printed because, quote, it may accrue inconveniences. And I was trying to figure that out. Maybe they thought it would just confuse people if they printed the law notice saying we're now required to print laws. So they're not going to do that. They're going to start after that law. The court drew up a committee to respond to the Lord Protector's letter, and they planned a trip to England. And again, I can't find any of this in the writing, so I don't know exactly what's going on there. The court went back into session in August, and the big order of business there, they repealed the law banning trade with the Dutch. They also restricted the slaughtering of sheep to those over 2 years of age and banned the import of malt. So it seems like things with New Netherland are beginning to get better with no conflict. The court got back together again in October, so now they're no longer doing twice a year. It seems like they're doing once every other month. And passed a law banning the drunkenness of natives and limiting wine sales to the natives to 1 pint. The colony's militias were also disbanded, so another promising sign there with New Netherland. The court also ordered a man by the name of Edward Sanders to be whipped multiple times for the rape of Ruth Parsons. Following the punishment, Sanders was ordered to wear a rope around his neck that dropped 2 feet in length for an indefinite period of time. Benjamin Saucer was accused of blasphemy for saying that he knew no God but his sword while a part of the militia. The debate of whether this was a capital offense came before the general court, so they were thinking about executing him. But before a determination could be made, Benjamin Saucer escaped. And I have yet to see anything about him being recaptured. The court got together again in November and formed a committee to draft a law against blasphemy. So the blasphemy question of Benjamin Saucer led to a committee actually drafting a law. The court then brought forth the case of John Gifford. Gifford was accused of stealing from his town. So here we go again. The taxes go up We bring in auditors, we hire auditors, treasurers, new positions, new to the new world. And John Gifford is the first to be accused of stealing. So they bring in the auditors to look at what Gifford's doing, and they find no evidence of theft. Well, this angers the public, and it causes a second investigation to be called. So the public's mad. Here comes another investigation. The second investigation found that Mr. Gifford made false charges, had expended vast gifts, undercounted the profits of the ironworks and farms, and made improper use of funds for himself. Essentially, the second investigation says Mr. Gifford embezzled. The court found that the defendant should have been able to cover all finances with about £2,500. So that's what the legitimate spending should have been. But the actual expenditures were £3,572. So basically, he misappropriated £1,000 of public finances. And again, this is part of the whole issue with higher taxes. The public is going to be calling on the government to spend more responsibly. The investigation was extended further into the next general court session. So they're going to talk about it more later. So no charges have been filed. Allegations have been raised, but no charges have been filed criminally against Mr. Gifford. But the audit system that the colony sets up seems to begin to pay off. Next week, we're going to continue to talk about John Gifford and some new visitors who make a very unwelcome visit to the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And we'll talk about that next time on Historical Context.